The carriage stopped hard, and Eleanor Whitfield nearly fell off her seat. Outside the window, the tall iron gates of Camden Hall stood open, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She pressed her gloved hand against her chest and tried to slow her breathing, but her heart would not listen. In 1 hour, she would be married to a man she had never met. In 1 hour, her name would no longer be her own. Her father had told her very little. He had said only that the Duke of Camden was a good man from a good family, and that the marriage would save them from ruin. He did not tell her that the Duke had not walked in 2 years. He did not tell her that half of London whispered behind their fans that the Duke of Camden was no longer a whole man, that his accident in the hunting field had taken more than the use of his legs. Eleanor learned this only 2 days before the wedding, from a maid who thought she already knew. Now, sitting in the carriage with her hands shaking in her lap, she wondered what kind of man she was about to marry. A broken one, people said, a bitter one, a man who had shut himself away in his great house and refused every visitor except his physician. The carriage door opened, and cold autumn air rushed in. A footman helped her down, and she looked up at the enormous stone house before her. Camden Hall was beautiful, in the way that old, sad things are beautiful. Ivy climbed the walls. The windows were tall and dark. Somewhere inside, a man was waiting to become her husband, and Eleanor felt, for the first time in her life, truly afraid. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Ashby, led her through the entrance hall without much warmth. "His Grace is waiting in the drawing room," she said. "He does not like to be kept waiting, and he does not like fuss. You would do well to remember both." Eleanor nodded, though her throat was too tight to speak. She followed Mrs. Ashby down a long corridor, lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, each one watching her pass with painted eyes. At the end of the corridor, 2 large doors stood closed. Mrs. Ashby knocked once, then opened them, without waiting for an answer. "Your Grace," she said, "Miss Whitfield has arrived." The room was dim, lit only by a low fire and a few candles. Eleanor stepped inside, and her eyes found him at once. He sat near the window in a wooden chair with wheels, his broad shoulders straight despite everything, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. He did not look broken. He looked like a man carved from stone, sharp-jawed and proud, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "So," he said, his voice was deep and steady, "you are the girl my future father tells me will save my family's fortune." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. "I am Eleanor Whitfield, Your Grace. I know who you are." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt as though he could see straight through her borrowed courage. "Tell me, Miss Whitfield, did your father explain to you what you are marrying? Or did he simply tell you there was a title attached to it?" "He told me you were a good man," she said quietly. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to name. "Did he tell you I cannot walk? Did he tell you what people say about me in the clubs and the ballrooms, when they think no one who matters can hear them?" Eleanor lifted her chin, surprising herself with her own steadiness. "He did not need to. I heard it from your own household before I ever heard it from him." For a moment, the Duke said nothing. Then, to her surprise, one corner of his mouth lifted, though it was not quite a smile. "At least you are honest. That is more than I expected." "Is honesty so rare in this house?" "Pity is common in this house," he said, and his voice turned hard again. "Honesty is rare everywhere." The wedding took place 2 hours later, in the small chapel behind the house. There were no crowds, no cheering guests, only the vicar, Mrs. Ashby, and a handful of servants standing at the back with careful, neutral faces. Eleanor walked down the short aisle alone, since her father had stayed behind in London to manage what remained of his debts. The Duke waited for her near the altar, his chair positioned with quiet dignity, his back straight, his eyes never leaving hers. When the vicar asked if she would take this man as her husband, Eleanor's voice did not shake. She said yes, and she meant it, though she could not have said exactly why. Perhaps it was his eyes. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her honestly, instead of with pity, as though she were a person and not simply a solution to his family's problems. That night, after a quiet supper eaten mostly in silence, Eleanor was led to her new chambers, which connected to his through a single door. She sat at the edge of her bed in her nightdress, her long hair loose over her shoulders, and waited, though she did not know what she was waiting for. The connecting door opened slowly. The Duke wheeled himself into the room, and for the first time since she had arrived, he looked uncertain. He stopped a few feet from the bed and studied her face, as though searching for something. Fear, perhaps. Disgust. She gave him neither. "You may speak plainly," he said. "Tell me you are afraid of me. Tell me you did not expect a husband like this." "I am not afraid of you," Eleanor said, and it was true. "I am afraid of what people expect this marriage to be. I am afraid of failing at something I do not understand." His jaw tightened. "Then let me be plain as well. I know what the world says about men like me. I know they whisper that I am no husband at all, that I cannot give a wife what she deserves." He wheeled himself closer, until he was near enough that she could see the storm behind his gray eyes. "I will not have you believe it. Whatever else is broken in me, I can still perform. You think I can't. I promise you, wife, I can still please you." The words hung in the air between them, bold and raw and strange. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she did not look away. There was something in his voice that was not boasting. It was a wound speaking, a proud man defending the last piece of himself the world had not yet taken. "I did not ask for proof of anything tonight," she said softly. "I ask only for honesty. You have already given me that." He looked at her for a long moment, as though her answer had surprised him more than any argument could have. Then, slowly, the hardness in his face eased, just slightly. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we will begin learning what kind of marriage this will be." He wheeled himself back through the connecting door, leaving her alone in the candlelight. Eleanor sat very still for a long time, listening to the old house settle around her, thinking of gray eyes and a voice that had promised so much and asked for so little in return. She did not know yet what kind of man she had married, but she knew, with a strange and quiet certainty, that he was not the broken thing the world believed him to be. Outside her window, the wind moved through the dark trees of Camden Hall, and somewhere in the great house, its master sat alone, with his pride and his fear, wondering if the girl with the steady eyes might be the first person in 2 years who did not see him as something less than a man. Morning came slowly to Camden Hall. Eleanor woke to pale light through heavy curtains and the sound of birds in the garden below. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered, and her stomach tightened with the strange mixture of fear and curiosity that had followed her since the wedding. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray gown, and made her way downstairs. She found the Duke already in the breakfast room, seated at the head of the long table, a cup of tea steaming before him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Good morning," she said finally. "Good morning, Duchess." He said the title carefully, as though testing how it sounded. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough." She took her seat across from him. A footman placed a plate before her, and she picked at her food while the silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, but not unkind either. "You will find this house quiet," the Duke said after a while. "I do not entertain. I do not attend balls or dinners in town. My days are much the same, one after another." "That does not frighten me," Eleanor said. "I have spent my whole life in quiet rooms, waiting for something to happen. Perhaps I will find more here than I expect." He studied her again, with that same searching look, as though trying to decide whether to believe her. "We shall see, Duchess. We shall see." Outside, the autumn sun rose higher over Camden Hall, casting long golden light across the gardens and the old stone walls. Eleanor did not yet know what her marriage would become, whether it would be a prison or a beginning. But she knew, as she sat across from her husband in the quiet morning light, that nothing about this house, or this man, was what she had expected. And somewhere beneath her fear, a small and stubborn hope had already begun to grow. After breakfast, the Duke wheeled himself toward the tall windows that looked out over the east garden. Eleanor followed, uncertain if she was meant to, but he did not send her away. Together they watched a gardener trimming a hedge in the pale light, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "My mother planted those roses," the Duke said quietly, nodding toward a bed of thorny stems near the fountain. "Before she died, she used to say a garden shows more patience than any person she ever knew. It waits through winter without complaint, trusting spring will come." "Do you believe that, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked. "That spring always comes?" He was quiet for a moment. I believed it once. Lately I have had less reason to. Perhaps that is why you need a wife who still believes it, she said, surprising herself with her own boldness. He turned to look at her, and something in his gray eyes softened, just slightly, like ice beginning to crack under the first warm day of the season. Perhaps, he said, we will see, Duchess, whether you still believe it, after you have lived in this house a while longer. I intend to, Eleanor answered, and she meant it with her whole heart, though she could not yet explain why a man she had known for less than a day had already begun to matter to her so much. The gardener below continued his quiet work, unaware that above him, in the tall window of Camden Hall, a new duchess and her wounded husband stood side by side for the first time, neither one certain of the road ahead, but neither one entirely alone anymore either. A crash echoed through the upstairs hallway, sharp and sudden, and Eleanor dropped the book she was holding and ran. She found the Duke on the floor of his study, his chair overturned beside him, a heavy shelf of books scattered across the rug. His face was tight with pain, and something worse than pain, a raw and burning shame that made him refuse to look at her. Leave, he said through clenched teeth. Send for Harmon. I do not need your help. Eleanor did not leave. She knelt beside him, ignoring his sharp words, and began gathering the fallen chair. You can be angry with me later, she said. Right now, you are on the floor, and I intend to help you off it. I did not ask for your pity. This is not pity, she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. This is a wife helping her husband. There is a difference, though you seem determined not to see it. For a moment he simply stared at her, breathing hard, his pride and his need warring openly across his face. Then, slowly, some of the fight went out of him. Together, with the help of Harmon the valet who arrived moments later, they got him back into his chair. Eleanor busied herself restacking the fallen books so he would not have to watch her watching him, and when she finally looked up, she saw something new in his expression. Not anger, something closer to surprise. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding, and Eleanor was beginning to understand the shape of her new life. Camden Hall ran like a clock built around one man's careful routines. The Duke woke early and worked in his study until midday, managing the estate's accounts with a sharp mind that clearly had not been dulled by his injury. He ate luncheon alone, unless Eleanor insisted on joining him, which she had begun to do more often than not. In the afternoons, he rode in his chair through the gardens when the weather allowed, refusing any help unless the ground grew too rough to manage. In the evenings he read, or wrote letters, or sat in silence by the fire, and Eleanor had learned that silence was often when he was thinking hardest about the things he refused to say aloud. She had also learned that the household staff moved around him with a kind of careful caution, as though he were made of glass rather than flesh and bone. Mrs. Ashby fussed over meals he did not want fussed over. Harmon hovered nearby even when the Duke waved him away. Only Eleanor, it seemed, had begun to treat him as a man rather than a fragile thing to be managed, and she suspected that was exactly why he tolerated her presence more than anyone else's. You should not have come running, he said later that evening, once his study had been set right and the servants had gone. A shelf falling is not an emergency. It sounded like one, Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from his desk uninvited. Forgive me for caring whether my husband is hurt. I was not hurt. I was embarrassed. He said the word as though it cost him something to admit it. There is a difference, though I suspect you already understand that better than most. I understand it very well, Eleanor said. I grew up watching my father lose everything he had built, piece by piece, and pretend each time that it did not matter. Pride is a heavy thing to carry alone, Your Grace. I do not intend to make you carry it entirely by yourself, whether you wish it or not. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. You are a stubborn woman. I have been told that before. I do not entirely dislike it, he admitted, and something in his voice, some small crack in his usual guarded control, made Eleanor's chest tighten with an emotion she did not yet have a name for. Over the following days, small moments accumulated between them like stones building a bridge. She learned that his name was Nathaniel, though almost no one used it, and that he preferred strong tea with no sugar, and that he had a low, unexpected laugh that he seemed almost ashamed of whenever it escaped him. He learned that she loved to read novels her father considered improper, that she hummed old country songs when she thought no one could hear her, and that she was far braver than her quiet manner first suggested. One afternoon, walking with him through the gardens while his chair rolled slowly along the gravel path, Eleanor asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. "What happened to you? The accident, I mean. No one in this house speaks of it, as though the words themselves might cause harm." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer, as he had refused so many things since her arrival. But then he sighed, and some of the tension left his shoulders. It was a hunting accident. 2 years ago, on my own land, on a horse I had ridden 100 times before. The ground gave way beneath us near the old stone wall, and I do not remember much after that, only waking in this house with a physician telling me I would never walk again. "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly. "Everyone is sorry." His voice turned bitter, sorry, and careful, and full of pity, dressed up as kindness. My own mother could not look at me without weeping in those first months. My closest friends stopped visiting within the year, uncertain how to speak to the man I had become. Only my father remained the same toward me, and he died 6 months after the accident, so even that did not last. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "I am not sorry for you, Nathaniel. I am sorry for what happened, but I do not see a broken man when I look at you. I see someone who has spent 2 years convinced the world only values what he can no longer do, when the truth is far simpler than that. And what is the truth, in your estimation? That you are still the same clever, stubborn, proud man you must have been before the accident. The only thing that changed is how much you trust anyone to see it." He said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Then, quietly, he said, "You are the first person in 2 years to speak to me as though I have not already lost everything worth having." "Then perhaps it is time someone did," Eleanor answered, and she reached out, without quite deciding to, and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of his chair. He did not pull away. That evening, at dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than it had before, filled with small observations and quiet laughter that surprised them both. Afterward, in the drawing room, Nathaniel asked her to play the pianoforte, and though she protested that she was hardly skilled, she sat and played an old song her mother had taught her, imperfect and warm, while he watched her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that looked almost like peace. Later, as she prepared for bed, there was a soft knock at the connecting door. Nathaniel wheeled himself in, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his usual guarded expression nowhere to be found. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for this afternoon in the garden. For not looking away from the truth, and for not letting me hide behind my own bitterness either." "You do not need to thank me for caring about my husband," Eleanor said gently. "Perhaps not. But I find that I want to, all the same." He hesitated, then added, more quietly, "I have not felt like myself in a very long time, Eleanor. Tonight, for the first time since the accident, I did." Eleanor crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, so that their eyes were level. "Then let tonight be the first of many," she said, and when he reached out and gently touched her face, she did not pull away either. The days that followed carried a new lightness through Camden Hall, though it did not arrive without its own small troubles. Mrs. Ashby, unused to a mistress who asked questions and made changes, grew short-tempered whenever Eleanor suggested altering the household routines that had stood unchanged since before the accident. "His Grace prefers his study kept exactly as it is," the housekeeper said one morning, when Eleanor asked if the heavy curtains might be opened wider to let in more light. "It has been that way for 2 years, Your Grace, and I see no reason to change it now." "Perhaps that is precisely the reason to change it," Eleanor answered, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "A man does not heal faster in the dark, Mrs. Ashby. I mean no disrespect to how you have managed this house, but I intend to bring a little more light into it, in every sense of the word." The housekeeper's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more, and by afternoon, the curtains in the study had been drawn back to let in the pale autumn sun. When Nathaniel wheeled himself in and found the room transformed, he said nothing at first, only sat very still, looking at the light falling across his desk, as though he had forgotten what it felt like. "Mrs. Ashby tells me this was your doing," he said finally. "It was," Eleanor admitted, bracing herself for his anger. "If you wish it changed back, I will not argue." He was quiet for a long moment. "Leave it," he said at last. "I had forgotten how much I disliked the dark until just now." It was a small victory, but it gave Eleanor courage, and over the following days she made other small changes, careful and slow, never pushing further than he seemed willing to bend. She had fresh flowers brought in from the garden despite the cooling weather. She encouraged the cook to prepare dishes Nathaniel had once enjoyed before the accident, dishes Mrs. Ashby admitted he had stopped requesting out of some unspoken grief. Slowly, without announcing it, Eleanor began coaxing life back into a house that had spent 2 years holding its breath. Not every change came easily. One evening, a letter arrived from a former friend of Nathaniel's, a man named Charles Pemberton, who wrote with careless cheer about a hunting party he was organizing for the coming month, seemingly forgetting, or perhaps never truly understanding, why such an invitation might wound rather than please. Eleanor found her husband afterward sitting alone in his study, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face carved from stone. "They do not think of me as a man anymore," he said quietly, not looking up as she entered. "They think of me as an absence. A person who used to exist before the accident took him away." Eleanor crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking the crumpled letter gently from his hand. "Then write him back," she said. "Tell him plainly what he cannot see for himself. You are still here, Nathaniel. You are still the same man who once rode across these fields and laughed too loud at his own jokes, according to Mrs. Ashby, who let that detail slip only last week." A reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "She should not have told you that. She adores you, in her own strict way," Eleanor said. "As do I, more and more with each passing day, though I suspect neither of us expected that when I arrived here 3 weeks ago." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. Fragile and new, and entirely unexpected. "Nor did I," he admitted quietly. "I expected a stranger sent to secure my family's fortune. I did not expect someone who would fight this hard to bring me back to myself." "Then perhaps we were both wrong about what this marriage would become," Eleanor said, and when he reached for her hand this time, she laced her fingers through his without hesitation, feeling for the first time that the walls of Camden Hall no longer felt like a prison, but the slow, uncertain beginning of something that might, given time and patience, become a true home. Outside, the wind moved through the old trees of Camden Hall, carrying the last of autumn's leaves across the quiet gardens, where roses still clung stubbornly to their thorny stems, waiting, as they always had, for spring to prove them right. UA. A letter arrived from London, bearing a seal Eleanor recognized at once, and her hands went cold before she had even broken it open. It was from her father, and inside, folded carefully, was a second letter, written in a hand she had hoped never to see again. She was in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own when the post arrived, and she read the letter twice before she trusted herself to understand it correctly. It was from Lord Anthony Vane, the man her father had once promised her to, before the engagement collapsed in scandal 2 years earlier, a scandal Eleanor had spent every day since trying to forget. Lord Vane wrote now with false concern, congratulating her on her marriage while making clear, in careful and cutting words, that he intended to visit Camden Hall soon, and that he looked forward to renewing their acquaintance. Eleanor sat very still for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. She had told no one at Camden Hall about Lord Vane, not even Nathaniel, though she suspected the servants in London still whispered about the broken engagement whenever her name was mentioned. The truth was simple and painful. 2 years ago, she had believed herself in love with Anthony Vane, had believed his promises of devotion, until she discovered he intended to marry her only for her father's remaining connections in trade, connections he abandoned the moment they proved less valuable than he had hoped. He had ended the engagement publicly, cruelly, leaving Eleanor's reputation bruised and her family's finances no better than before. She had told herself, arriving at Camden Hall weeks ago, that her past no longer mattered, that a new husband and a new life meant a chance to leave old wounds behind. Now, holding Lord Vane's letter, she understood that some wounds did not stay buried simply because one wished them to. That evening, she found Nathaniel in his study, the fire burning low, a glass of brandy untouched on the desk beside him. He looked up when she entered, and something in her face must have betrayed her, because his expression sharpened with concern at once. "What has happened?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then crossed the room and placed the letter before him without a word. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he finished, he set it down with careful precision, as though controlling his hands took real effort. "Who is this man to you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He was to be my husband, once," Eleanor admitted, her cheeks burning with a shame she had carried silently for 2 years. "Before you, before any of this. My father arranged it when I was 18, and I believed myself fortunate, until Lord Vane discovered our family's fortune was smaller than he had hoped, and ended the engagement in the cruelest way he could manage, in front of half of London society. And now he writes to you, as though nothing happened at all. He writes to remind me that he still has the power to embarrass me, should he choose to," Eleanor said quietly. "I did not tell you before, because I did not wish you to think less of me for it." Nathaniel wheeled himself closer, until he could take her hand in his. "Eleanor, look at me. Do you imagine I have not carried my own shame into this marriage? A man who cannot walk, who spent 2 years believing himself worth nothing to anyone, who married a stranger because it was the only path left to secure his family's future. If anyone in this house has cause to judge the other for old wounds, it is certainly not me." "You did not choose your accident," Eleanor said. "I chose to trust a man who did not deserve it. You were 18 years old, and newly introduced to a world that rewards cruelty, dressed as charm," Nathaniel said firmly. "That is not a failure of judgment, Eleanor. That is simply what happens to the young and the hopeful, before life teaches them to be more careful." He paused, his gray eyes steady on hers. "I will not let this man embarrass you in my house. If he comes here expecting to find a broken duke and a fragile duchess he can toy with, he will find something else entirely." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being understood so completely. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not need to thank me," he said, echoing her own words from weeks before, and something passed between them, quiet and certain, that felt very much like the beginning of trust neither of them had expected to find again. Over the following days, as they waited for word of Lord Vane's promised visit, Nathaniel spoke more openly than he ever had before about his own past, as though Eleanor's honesty had loosened something long held tight within him. He told her about the accident in greater detail than he had shared in the garden weeks earlier, about the sound of the horse screaming as it fell, about waking 3 days later in a darkened room with a physician's grim face hovering above him, delivering news that ended one version of his life entirely. "The worst of it was not the pain," he admitted one evening, staring into the fire. "The worst of it was watching people decide, one by one, that I no longer mattered the way I once had. Friends who stopped writing. A woman I had once considered courting, who sent flowers once and never visited again. Even my own mother, who could not look at me for the first month without weeping, as though I had already died and only my body remained to remind her of the loss." "Your mother must have loved you very much to grieve so deeply," Eleanor said gently. "She loved the son who could ride and dance and inherit everything without complication," Nathaniel said, his voice bitter but quieter now than she had ever heard it. "I am not certain she ever learned to love the son who remained." "Then she was wrong not to try harder," Eleanor said firmly. "And so was everyone else who looked at you and saw only what was gone, instead of everything that remained." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "You keep saying things like that, as though you truly believe them." "I do believe them," Eleanor said simply. "I have believed them more with each passing week I have spent in this house, watching you manage an entire estate with a sharper mind than most men who still have the use of their legs, watching you care for your servants and your land, and now, it seems for me, despite every reason you might have had to remain guarded and alone." He reached for her hand again, and this time he pressed a kiss to her knuckles, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are dangerous, Eleanor Ashworth," he murmured, using her married name for the first time since the wedding. "You make a man believe things he had long ago decided were impossible." "Good," Eleanor whispered. "You have spent far too long believing the wrong things about yourself." 3 days later, Lord Vane's carriage arrived at Camden Hall unannounced, exactly as Eleanor had feared he might. She stood at Nathaniel's side in the entrance hall, as the footman announced their unwelcome guest, her chin lifted with a courage she did not entirely feel, her husband's steady presence beside her, the only thing keeping her fear from showing on her face. Lord Vane stepped inside with the same careless charm she remembered, his eyes moving over her with an appraising coldness that made her skin crawl, before shifting to Nathaniel with poorly concealed pity. "Camden," he said, offering a shallow bow. "I had heard the rumors, of course, but I confess I did not expect to find them so entirely true." "Vane," Nathaniel said evenly, his voice carrying an authority that filled the entrance hall despite his stillness. "You have traveled a long way to satisfy your curiosity. I hope the journey proves worth your trouble." "I came to congratulate my former intended on her marriage," Lord Vane said, his gaze sliding back to Eleanor with false warmth. "Though I confess, Eleanor, I hardly expected you to settle for quite so limited a match." The room went very still. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with the old, familiar shame, the same helpless anger she had carried since the day he had humiliated her in front of London society. But before she could find her voice, Nathaniel spoke, his tone calm and utterly without mercy. "Lord Vane," he said, "I understand you once had the privilege of courting my wife, and that you abandoned that privilege the moment it stopped serving your ambitions. I find it curious that a man with so little honor feels qualified to judge the limitations of anyone else." Lord Vane's smile faltered. "I meant no offense, Your Grace." "You meant precisely the offense you intended," Nathaniel said. "And you will find, I think, that my wife is no longer the uncertain girl you once wounded so carelessly. She stands beside a husband who values her far more than you ever managed to, whole legs or no. I suggest you finish whatever business brought you here, and then leave my house before I forget my manners entirely." Eleanor watched, something fierce and warm blooming in her chest, as Lord Vane's confidence crumbled beneath her husband's unshaken authority. Within the hour, he was gone, his carriage disappearing down the long drive, and Eleanor turned to Nathaniel, with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Thank you," she said again, though the words felt too small for what she truly meant. "You never needed defending, Eleanor," Nathaniel said gently, drawing her hand to his lips once more. "You only needed someone willing to stand beside you while you defended yourself. I intend to be that someone, for as long as you will have me." That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way down to the study, where a thin line of candlelight still showed beneath the door. She found Nathaniel exactly where she expected, seated at his desk, though he was not working. He was simply staring into the dying fire, his expression distant. "You should be resting," she said softly, stepping inside. "I find I cannot," he admitted. Seeing that man again reminded me of things I had tried to leave behind. He gestured for her to sit, and she took the chair across from him, drawing her shawl tighter. "After the accident, my mother sent for a physician from London, a man who specialized in cases like mine. He examined me for nearly 2 hours, and afterward he sat with my mother in this very room, and spoke as though I were not present at all, as though the man in the chair between them had already stopped mattering." "What did he say?" Eleanor asked gently. "He said I would likely never father an heir, never dance at my own sister's wedding, never again be the man my family had once been proud to present in society." Nathaniel's voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the old pain beneath it, worn smooth by 2 years of repetition, but never fully healed. "My mother wept for a week afterward. Not for me, I think, but for the version of her son she had already begun mourning. And the physician was wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "About the heir, certainly, if what you told me on our wedding night held any truth at all." A faint smile crossed her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation, and after a moment, Nathaniel's mouth curved in answer. "He was wrong about a great many things," Nathaniel agreed. "Though it has taken me 2 years and a wife braver than any physician's diagnosis to begin believing that fully." Eleanor rose and crossed the room, kneeling beside his chair, as she had done so many times now that the gesture felt entirely natural. "Then let his words die in this room tonight, Nathaniel. You are not the list of things he decided you could no longer do. You are the man who defended me today, with more strength than any physician could measure, who runs this entire estate, without a single misstep, who makes his household laugh again after 2 years of silence, whether he admits to it or not. You give me too much credit. I give you exactly what you have earned, Eleanor said, nothing more and nothing less. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, despite the strength she knew rested in his hands. When my father was alive, he said quietly, he used to tell me that a Camden man measures himself by how he treats those who cannot repay him. I spent so long after the accident, believing I had nothing left to give anyone, that I had become a burden rather than a benefit to this family. You have made me remember what my father actually meant. It was never about what a man can do with his legs. It was always about what he chooses to do with his heart, regardless of what else has been taken from him. Eleanor felt her own eyes fill with unexpected tears. Your father sounds as though he would have been proud of the man sitting before me now. I hope so, Nathaniel said softly. I have spent a long time hoping so, without quite believing it, until recently. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire burning lower, the great house settling quietly around them, as it always did at this late hour. Finally, Eleanor rose, brushing a soft kiss against his forehead before turning toward the door. Get some rest, Nathaniel, she said. Tomorrow the sun will rise on a house that finally remembers how to be a home again. Because of you, he said quietly, watching her go. Because of both of us, she answered, and left him with the fire, and his memories, and a hope that no longer felt quite so fragile as it once had. The following morning brought a letter of an entirely different sort, one that lifted, rather than troubled the household. It came from Nathaniel's younger sister Charlotte, who had married 2 years earlier and moved to Bath, and who wrote now to say she intended to visit Camden Hall before winter set in fully, eager to meet the new Duchess she had heard so much about, even in her distant corner of England. Nathaniel read the letter twice, an expression of genuine pleasure crossing his face for the first time since Eleanor had known him. Charlotte has not visited since before the accident, he explained, setting the letter down. She wrote often in the early months, but our correspondence grew thin over time, more from my own reluctance to be seen than any fault of hers. I confess, I did not expect her to propose a visit so readily. Perhaps she simply needed a reason worth traveling for, Eleanor said, smiling. It seems you have provided her with one. It seems I have, Nathaniel agreed, and for the rest of that day, Camden Hall hummed with a new energy, rooms being prepared, menus discussed, a household slowly waking from a long and careful silence, as though it too had been waiting, like the roses in the garden, for someone to finally believe that spring might truly be on its way. Charlotte arrived at Camden Hall in a whirlwind of trunks and bright laughter, and within the first hour, Eleanor understood exactly why Nathaniel had once written to her so often. She was quick-witted and warm, with the same steady gray eyes as her brother, and she embraced Eleanor, as though they had known each other for years rather than minutes. So you are the woman who has finally coaxed my brother out of his fortress, Charlotte said, studying Eleanor with open curiosity, as they sat together in the drawing room, while Nathaniel spoke with the coachman outside. I confess, from his letters these past weeks, I hardly recognized him. He used to write me the shortest, most miserable little notes imaginable. Now he tells me about roses and pianoforte songs, and a duchess who argues with Mrs. Ashby about curtains. Eleanor laughed, despite herself. I did not realize I had made such an impression through the post. You have made an impression on everything in this house, Charlotte said, her teasing softening into something more sincere. I have not heard him sound like himself in 2 years, Eleanor. Whatever you have done, please do not stop doing it. That evening, over a dinner filled with more laughter than Camden Hall had likely seen in years, Eleanor watched Nathaniel with his sister, and saw glimpses of the man he must have been before the accident, quick to tease, generous with his attention, entirely at ease in his own home. When Charlotte finally retired for the night, exhausted from her journey, Nathaniel wheeled himself alongside Eleanor toward the drawing room, where a fire still burned low. Thank you, he said, once they were alone, for welcoming her so warmly. I know I have been difficult these past 2 years, difficult enough that even my own sister grew cautious about visiting. She loves you very much, Eleanor said. It was easy to welcome someone who clearly wants only good things for you. As do you, Nathaniel said quietly, and something in his voice made Eleanor's heart quicken. I have been thinking, these past weeks, about the promise I made you on our wedding night, about proving myself to you, in ways I have been too afraid to attempt since the accident. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look away. You have already proven a great deal to me, Nathaniel. More than you seem to realize. Perhaps, he said, but there is one promise I have not yet kept, and I find that I no longer wish to leave it unspoken between us any longer. He reached for her hand, his grip steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I have spent 2 years believing that part of my life had ended, along with the use of my legs. I let that belief keep me distant from you, even as everything else between us grew closer. I do not wish to be afraid any longer, Eleanor. Not with you. Eleanor's breath caught. Nathaniel, you do not need to prove anything to me. I have never once doubted your worth as a husband, whole or otherwise. I know, he said softly. That is precisely why I want to. Not to prove anything to you, but because I have fallen in love with my own wife, entirely and completely, and I no longer wish to hold any part of myself back from her out of fear. The words settled between them, quiet and profound, and Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes for the second time that week, though this time they came from a fullness of heart rather than old sorrow. I love you too, she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. I did not expect to, not when I arrived here so frightened and uncertain, but I do, Nathaniel, completely. He drew her closer, and when their lips finally met, it was gentle and unhurried, filled with 2 years of loneliness, finally beginning to unravel, and something newer and brighter growing in its place. Eleanor felt his hand cup her face with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have, and when they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Nathaniel's eyes held none of the guarded distance she had grown so used to seeing there. Come with me, he said quietly, and Eleanor did not hesitate. That night, in the privacy of his chambers, Nathaniel proved the promise he had made on their wedding night, not through boasting or bravado, but through patience and tenderness that left no room for doubt. He showed her, without a single word needed, that whatever the accident had taken from him, it had not taken his ability to love her fully, to please her thoroughly, to make her feel more cherished than she had ever felt in her life. Eleanor understood, in the quiet hours that followed, wrapped in his arms as the fire burned low, that the promise whispered on their wedding night had never truly been about physical proof at all. It had been about a man determined to matter, to be seen as whole, to be loved, not despite his limitations, but entirely alongside them. And in that understanding, she found that she loved him more deeply than she had believed possible only weeks before. Morning came softly, sunlight filtering through the curtains Eleanor had insisted on opening weeks earlier, and she woke to find Nathaniel already watching her, an expression of quiet wonder on his face that she had never seen there before. Good morning, Duchess, he said, echoing his words from their first breakfast together, though his voice now carried none of the careful distance it once had. Good morning, husband, Eleanor answered, smiling as she settled closer against him. You look different this morning. I feel different, Nathaniel admitted. For 2 years, I believed I had lost the man I once was. I think, perhaps, I have simply been waiting for the right person to help me find him again. I am glad I could help, Eleanor said softly. You did far more than help, Nathaniel said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. You gave me my life back, Eleanor. I do not think I can ever fully repay you for that. You do not owe me repayment, Eleanor said. Only your honesty, and your patience, and whatever love you have left to give. That has always been more than enough. Downstairs, Charlotte greeted them both at breakfast, with a knowing smile that made Eleanor blush, though she said nothing beyond a cheerful comment about how well they both looked that morning. The days that followed passed in a warmth Camden Hall had not known in years, filled with long walks through the garden, quiet evenings by the fire, and a closeness between husband and wife that grew deeper with each passing day. Charlotte extended her visit by another fortnight, delighted by the change in her brother, and even Mrs. Ashby's stern demeanor softened as she watched the household she had cared for so faithfully finally begin to heal. But even as Eleanor allowed herself to believe that the hardest days of her marriage were behind her, a shadow was already gathering at the edges of their happiness, one neither she nor Nathaniel yet knew to watch for. Miles away, in a cold townhouse in London, a distant cousin of Nathaniel's, A man named Edmund Ashworth, who stood only a few relations removed from the dukedom itself, had begun making careful inquiries about the health and legitimacy of the current Duke of Camden. Inquiries that would soon threaten everything Eleanor and Nathaniel had only just begun to build together. For now, though, Camden Hall remained a house at peace, its master no longer haunted by shadows of his own making, its new duchess more certain with each day that she had found, in the most unexpected of circumstances, a love deeper and truer than anything she had once believed herself capable of finding. On the morning of Charlotte's departure, the three of them gathered in the entrance hall while the coachman loaded the last of her trunks. Charlotte embraced Eleanor tightly, whispering close to her ear so that Nathaniel, waiting a few steps away, could not hear. "Whatever you have done for my brother," she said, "do not let anyone or anything take it from either of you. He has suffered enough. He deserves this happiness, and so, I think, do you. I intend to hold on to it, with everything I have," Eleanor promised, and she meant it fully, though she did not yet know how soon that promise would be tested. Charlotte turned to her brother next, and for a moment, the easy teasing between them fell away entirely. "You look well, Nathaniel," she said softly. "Truly well, for the first time since the accident. I am so glad I came." "So am I," Nathaniel said, reaching up to take her hand. "Write more often, Charlotte. I have missed you more than I ever admitted in my letters." "I will," she promised, "and you must write back properly this time. None of your short, miserable notes." He laughed, a full and easy sound that filled the entrance hall, and Eleanor felt her heart swell at the sight of it. When Charlotte's carriage finally disappeared down the long drive, Nathaniel remained at the window for a long while, watching the empty road with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. "You will see her again soon," Eleanor said gently, coming to stand beside him. "I know," he said. "I am simply remembering how close I came to losing all of this. My sister's visits, my own home, you." He looked up at her, his gray eyes serious. "There were months after the accident, when I believed I would spend the rest of my life alone in this house, forgotten by everyone who once cared for me. I do not take any of this lightly, Eleanor. Not anymore." "Nor do I," Eleanor said, and she meant it with her whole heart. That evening, as the household settled into its familiar quiet rhythm, Nathaniel called Eleanor into his study, where a stack of ledgers sat open on his desk. "I have been thinking about the future," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "about what this marriage might become, beyond these walls. I would like you to understand the full workings of this estate, Eleanor, not simply as my wife, but as its duchess in truth. There may come a day when decisions fall to you that I am not present to make, and I would rather you be prepared for that than left uncertain. That is a great deal of trust to place in someone who arrived here only weeks ago, knowing nothing of dukedoms or estates," Eleanor said, though she felt a quiet pride at his words. "You have earned every measure of it," Nathaniel said simply. "Besides, I suspect you will master these accounts faster than I did at your age." Over the following evenings, he walked her patiently through the ledgers, the tenant agreements, the careful balance of income and expense that kept Camden Hall standing. Eleanor absorbed it all with quiet determination, asking sharp questions that made Nathaniel's respect for her grow with each session, until what had begun as a simple lesson became something closer to true partnership. Two minds working together toward a shared future, neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them were determined to protect. Neither of them could have known, as they sat together late into those quiet autumn evenings, poring over figures and tenant names by candlelight, that far away in London, the careful inquiries already being made about the Duke of Camden's fitness to hold his title would soon arrive at their door, in far less friendly form than a sister's warm visit. A carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest arrived at Camden Hall, without warning, on a gray November morning, and the moment Eleanor saw the visitor step down from it, she felt an instinctive unease settle over her, sharp and immediate. The man was tall and thin, dressed in the fashionable dark colors favored by London's more ambitious gentlemen, his smile polished to a courteous shine that did not reach his cold eyes. "Edmund Ashworth," he introduced himself in the entrance hall, bowing with exaggerated formality toward Nathaniel's chair. "Cousin to his grace, though I confess, we have met so rarely over the years that I would not blame him for forgetting the connection entirely." Nathaniel's expression grew guarded the moment the name was spoken. "Edmund," he said carefully. "I had not expected to see you again, so soon after your last visit, which I recall was for my father's funeral, 4 years ago." "Family occasions do have a way of drawing us together," Edmund said smoothly, his gaze flicking briefly to Eleanor, with an assessment she did not care for. "And this, I assume, is your new Duchess. My congratulations on your marriage, cousin. I confess, the news reached London, rather later than one might expect, for a match of such importance." "We kept the wedding private," Nathaniel said, "as is our right." Of course, of course." Edmund's smile widened, though it did nothing to soften the calculation behind his eyes. "I wonder, cousin, if I might have a private word with you. A matter of family business that seemed better discussed in person than through the post." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with unease, but Nathaniel merely nodded, gesturing toward his study, and the two men disappeared behind its closed doors, while Eleanor waited in the drawing room, her mind turning over every possible reason for such an unannounced visit. It was nearly an hour before Nathaniel emerged, his face carved from a stillness Eleanor had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage, before she had learned to read the storms beneath his calm exterior. Edmund followed a few steps behind him, his polished smile still firmly in place, though there was something triumphant lurking beneath it that made Eleanor's unease sharpen into something closer to fear. "I shall take my leave for now," Edmund said, bowing once more toward Eleanor. "I look forward to seeing how matters resolve themselves, Duchess. I do hope, for both your sakes, that they resolve favorably." Once his carriage had disappeared down the drive, Eleanor turned to Nathaniel, who had not yet spoken a single word since Edmund's departure. "Nathaniel, what did he want?" "You look as though you have seen a ghost." Nathaniel wheeled himself toward the fire, staring into the flames for a long moment before finally speaking. "Edmund believes, or claims to believe, that my injury renders me unfit to continue holding the title of Duke of Camden. He has consulted lawyers in London, Eleanor, lawyers who suggest there may be grounds to petition for the title to pass to him instead, on the basis that a man who cannot walk, and who they suspect cannot father an heir, cannot properly fulfill the duties of a dukedom." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Can he truly do such a thing? Can a title simply be taken from you?" "It has never been done successfully, to my knowledge," Nathaniel said, though his voice carried little comfort. "But Edmund is patient and ambitious, and he has powerful friends in London who owe him favors. He does not need to succeed outright, Eleanor. He only needs to create enough doubt, enough scandal, to make the courts and society itself question whether I remain fit to hold what is rightfully mine, and if we do not produce an heir soon, that doubt will only grow stronger." "This is monstrous," Eleanor said, anger rising hot and fierce in her chest. "You are more capable of managing this estate than any man I have ever known. Your injury has nothing whatsoever to do with your fitness to hold your title. Try telling that to a courtroom full of men who have never once had to prove their own worth beyond the accident of their birth," Nathaniel said bitterly. "Edmund understands exactly what he is doing, Eleanor. He does not need the truth on his side. He only needs enough uncertainty." Over the following days, the household grew tense with a new kind of fear, one that neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel could entirely shield the servants from. Letters began arriving from London, some from concerned friends warning of rumors already spreading through society, others from lawyers Nathaniel retained to defend his position, each one carrying grim news that Edmund's campaign was gaining more traction than either of them had hoped. Whispers reached even Camden Hall's quiet corners, carried by visiting merchants and traveling servants, whispers that questioned whether the Duke of Camden could truly be considered whole enough to lead his family, whether his new Duchess had married a man soon to lose everything he possessed. Eleanor watched Nathaniel retreat, slowly and painfully, back into the guarded distance she had worked so hard to dismantle in the weeks since her arrival. He spent longer hours alone in his study, his temper shorter, his sleep more troubled, and though he never said so aloud, Eleanor understood that Edmund's cruel campaign had reopened every wound the accident itself had first inflicted. One evening, finding him alone in his study long after the rest of the household had retired, Eleanor sat across from him without invitation, refusing to be dismissed as she once might have been in the earliest days of their marriage. "You are letting him win," she said quietly. "Not in the courts, but here, inside yourself. I have watched you become the man you were meant to be these past months, Nathaniel, and I will not sit quietly while Edmund Ashworth undoes all of that from a comfortable distance in London." "You do not understand what is at stake," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "If he succeeds, Eleanor, you will lose your position, your home, everything I promised to provide you when we married. I cannot simply set that fear aside because you wish me to." "I did not marry you for a title, Nathaniel," Eleanor said fiercely. "I married you because you looked at me honestly on our wedding night, when you had every reason to hide behind pity and excuses instead. I do not care whether Edmund Ashworth succeeds in taking your title. I care that you do not let him take the man I fell in love with in the process." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "How do you remain so certain, through all of this?" "Because I have seen what you are capable of," Eleanor said. "I watched you defend me against Lord Vane, without a moment's hesitation. I have watched you manage this entire estate with more skill than most men who still have the use of every limb they were born with. Edmund Ashworth knows nothing of the man you truly are, Nathaniel. He only knows the rumors he wishes to believe, because they serve his ambitions. We will not let those rumors become the truth simply because we grew too tired to fight them." Something in her words seemed to reach him, cutting through the fear and exhaustion that had settled so heavily over him in recent days. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You are right," he said quietly. "I have let fear make decisions I should have made with clearer judgment. Forgive me, Eleanor. I did not mean to retreat from you when I needed you most." "There is nothing to forgive," Eleanor said gently. "But there is a great deal to plan, if we intend to make certain Edmund's schemes come to nothing." Together, over the following days, they began building a case of their own. Nathaniel wrote to physicians who had examined him honestly, requesting formal statements confirming his sound mind and his capable management of estate affairs despite his physical limitations. Eleanor, drawing on skills she had not known she possessed until circumstances demanded them, began cataloging every decision Nathaniel had made since the accident, every improvement to the estate's finances, every tenant dispute resolved fairly, every proof of his continued fitness that Edmund's lawyers would find difficult to dismiss. They also began, quietly and deliberately, appearing more often in society than either of them had planned before Edmund's visit. A dinner hosted at Camden Hall for the surrounding gentry, carefully arranged so that guests could see for themselves the sharp, capable Duke that rumor had painted as broken and unfit. A visit to the local magistrate's court, where Nathaniel's clear judgment in settling a tenant dispute left even skeptical observers reconsidering the whispers they had heard from London. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor and Nathaniel began reclaiming the narrative Edmund had tried so hard to control, refusing to let fear or shame dictate how the world would see them. Yet Edmund did not remain idle. Word reached them, through one of Nathaniel's few remaining loyal friends in London, that Edmund had begun circulating a petition among certain members of the House of Lords, questioning the legitimacy of Nathaniel's continued title, on grounds that grew more elaborate and more damaging with each retelling. There were even whispers, uglier than the rest, suggesting that Eleanor's own reputation, tarnished years earlier by her broken engagement to Lord Vane, made her an unsuitable duchess regardless of what became of her husband's title. "He is trying to attack us from every direction at once," Nathaniel said grimly, reading the latest report by candlelight one evening. "My fitness, your reputation, our marriage itself. He does not care which weapon proves effective, only that one of them eventually does." "Then we will simply have to prove him wrong on every count," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "Together, Nathaniel, as we have faced everything else." He looked at her with something like awe in his tired eyes. "I do not know what I would do without you standing beside me through all of this." "You will never have to find out," Eleanor promised, and though the battle ahead remained uncertain, she found, holding his hand in the flickering candlelight, that her fear had transformed into something far more useful, a fierce and unshakable determination to protect the life and the love they had built together, whatever it might cost them to defend it. The true test of that determination came a fortnight later, at a gathering hosted by Lady Winslow, one of the county's most influential hostesses, whose approval or disapproval could shape opinion far beyond her own drawing room. Nathaniel had been reluctant to attend, uncertain whether appearing in such a public setting so soon after Edmund's campaign began would help or harm their cause, but Eleanor had insisted. "Hiding will only feed the rumors," she told him firmly, helping him choose between two coats before they departed. "Let them see you exactly as you are, Nathaniel, sharp, capable, and entirely unwilling to be pitied." The evening began well enough, with polite conversation and careful pleasantries, but Eleanor noticed the way certain guests watched Nathaniel with poorly hidden curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands whenever they believed themselves unobserved. The tension broke when a portly gentleman named Sir Roger Fenwick, emboldened by too much wine, approached their corner of the room with a smile that held more mockery than warmth. "Camden," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "I confess, I am surprised to see you out and about. I had heard rather troubling things from London, about your fitness to manage your own affairs, let alone a dukedom." The room seemed to still around them, several conversations faltering as guests turned, unable to resist the promise of a scene. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet. "Sir Roger," she said, her tone pleasant but unmistakably firm, "I wonder if you have ever personally reviewed the tenant agreements my husband renegotiated last month, saving 3 families from eviction during a difficult harvest. Or perhaps you attended the county court session, where his judgment on a boundary dispute was praised by the magistrate himself as the fairest ruling given in a decade. I confess I have not heard you mentioned in either account, though I have heard your name mentioned rather often, in connection with unpaid debts at cards." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the nearby guests, and Sir Roger's face flushed a deep, humiliated red. "I meant no offense, Duchess," he mumbled, retreating quickly toward the refreshment table. Lady Winslow herself, who had observed the entire exchange from a few steps away, approached them with an expression of genuine respect. "Well spoken, Duchess," she said. "I confess, I had wondered, given the rumors circulating from London, what sort of woman the Duke of Camden had married. I am rather relieved to find her every bit as formidable as her husband." "Thank you, Lady Winslow," Eleanor said, inclining her head gracefully, though her heart still pounded from the confrontation. Later, in the carriage returning home, Nathaniel took her hand and held it firmly against his chest. "I have never seen anything quite so magnificent," he said, his voice warm with pride and something deeper. "You defended me tonight, as fiercely as any general defending his own honor." "I defended us," Eleanor corrected gently. "Edmund does not understand that attacking you means attacking me as well, Nathaniel. I do not intend to let him forget that lesson easily." News of the encounter spread through the county faster than either of them expected, and within days, several letters arrived expressing quiet support, from families who had benefited from Nathaniel's fair management of local affairs, from acquaintances who had grown tired of London's cruel gossip. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a clear sign that the narrative Edmund had tried so carefully to control was beginning, slowly and steadily, to shift back into their favor. Exable. The letter that finally broke Edmund Ashworth's campaign arrived on a cold morning in early December, carried by a rider Nathaniel's London friend had sent at considerable personal risk. Eleanor watched her husband's face as he read it, and though she could not see the words herself, she saw the shift in his expression, from grim determination to something closer to fierce satisfaction. "What is it?" she asked, unable to wait any longer. "Proof," Nathaniel said, setting the letter down with careful precision. "My friend Hartley has uncovered evidence that Edmund has been borrowing heavily against an inheritance he does not yet possess, promising creditors that the Camden fortune would soon be his to command. He has been so confident of success that he began spending money he has no legal right to, based entirely on the assumption that his petition against me would succeed." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That is fraud, surely." "It is precisely that," Nathaniel said, a hard edge of triumph entering his voice for the first time in weeks. "And it exposes exactly what Edmund's true motives have been from the start. This was never about family honor, or concern for the dukedom's future. It was about greed, plain and simple, dressed up in careful language about fitness and duty. Within days, Nathaniel had traveled to London himself, a journey that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, when he had refused to leave Camden Hall for any reason. Eleanor insisted on accompanying him, and together they met with the lawyers Nathaniel had retained, presenting Hartley's evidence alongside the physician's statements and the careful record of estate management Eleanor herself had compiled over the preceding weeks. The confrontation with Edmund himself took place in a cold, formal drawing room, borrowed from one of Nathaniel's few remaining allies among the peerage, a setting chosen deliberately to strip away any illusion of comfortable family gathering. Edmund arrived with his usual polished confidence, though Eleanor noticed, watching closely, the faint flicker of unease beneath his practiced smile when he saw the stack of documents laid out upon the table. "Cousin," Edmund said, offering his usual shallow bow, "I confess, I did not expect this meeting to be quite so formally arranged." "Sit down, Edmund," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying none of its former hesitation. "We have matters to discuss, and I find I no longer have patience for pleasantries." Edmund's smile faltered slightly as he took his seat, his eyes moving warily over the assembled lawyers and the documents before him. "I assume this concerns the petition." "It concerns your petition," Nathaniel said, "and the rather significant debts you have accumulated in London, based entirely on your confidence that it would succeed." He gestured, and one of the lawyers slid a folder across the table toward Edmund, who opened it with visibly trembling hands. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Edmund's face drained of color as he read through the documented evidence of his borrowing, his creditors' names, the promises he had made against a fortune that was never legally his to promise. "This changes nothing," Edmund said finally, though his voice carried far less confidence than before. "My petition still stands on its own merits, regardless of my personal financial affairs. Your petition stands on the claim that I am unfit to manage my own estate," Nathaniel said calmly. "And yet here, in this very folder, is a complete record of every decision I have made regarding Camden Hall since my accident, every tenant dispute resolved, every debt settled, every improvement made to the land and its people. Compare that, if you wish, to a man who has spent the last several months borrowing against an inheritance he does not possess, based on nothing more than wishful greed. I do not believe any court in England, once presented with both records side by side, will find your case particularly compelling." Edmund's composure cracked entirely then, his careful mask slipping to reveal the desperate ambition beneath it. "You do not understand what it has been like," he said, his voice rising with something close to panic. "Watching you inherit everything, simply by accident of birth, while I have spent my entire life scraping for whatever scraps of respectability I could manage. When I heard of your accident, I confess I saw an opportunity, and I will not apologize for wanting more than the little I was given." "You may want whatever you wish," Nathaniel said, his voice hardening, "but you do not have the right to steal it through slander and manipulation, nor to threaten my wife's reputation and my family's honor in pursuit of your own ambitions. I am willing to be generous, Edmund, given our shared blood. Withdraw your petition entirely. Repay what debts you can manage honestly, and I will not pursue legal action against you for fraud. Refuse, and I promise you, the full weight of what Hartley has uncovered will follow you into every drawing room in London." Edmund sat in silence for a long moment, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of his own failed scheme. Finally, quietly, he nodded. "I withdraw the petition," he said. "You have made your point, cousin." "Good," Nathaniel said, and there was no triumph in his voice now, only tired relief. "Then I believe our business here is concluded." As Edmund gathered himself to leave, his earlier confidence entirely gone, Eleanor spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable authority of its own. "Edmund," she said, and he paused, glancing back at her warily. "I hope, whatever comes next for you, that you learn there are better ways to build a life than tearing down someone else's. My husband has shown more strength facing his accident than you have shown facing your own ambitions honestly. I hope one day you find the same." Edmund said nothing, only nodded once before departing, and the room seemed to exhale as the door closed behind him. Nathaniel reached for Eleanor's hand, his grip trembling slightly with the release of tension he had carried for weeks. "It is over," he said softly, as though he could hardly believe it himself. "It is over," Eleanor confirmed, and she leaned down to press a gentle kiss against his forehead, feeling months of fear finally begin to loosen its grip on both their hearts. They remained in London only long enough to finalize matters with the lawyers before returning home to Camden Hall, and the journey back felt entirely different from the anxious trip that had brought them to the city. Nathaniel seemed lighter somehow, more at ease than Eleanor had ever seen him, as though Edmund's defeat had finally allowed him to release the last of the fear and shame he had carried since the accident. When they arrived home, Mrs. Ashby greeted them with uncharacteristic warmth, and even the servants seemed to sense that something significant had shifted, that the long shadow hanging over the house had finally lifted. That evening, seated together by the fire in the drawing room, where Eleanor had once played the pianoforte so hesitantly weeks before, Nathaniel took her hands in his and studied her face with an expression of quiet, complete devotion. "I have been thinking," he said, "about everything that has happened since you arrived at Camden Hall, about the man I was before you came, and the man I have become since." "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor asked softly. "That I spent 2 years defining myself entirely by what the accident took from me," Nathaniel said. "My legs, my confidence. My belief that anyone could ever look at me and see more than what I had lost. You changed that, Eleanor, not by pretending my injury did not exist, but by refusing to let it define the boundaries of what our marriage and my life could become. You did that yourself," Eleanor said gently. "I only reminded you of what was already true." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said, "but I do not think I would have found my way back to it without you standing beside me every step of the way." He drew her closer, his gray eyes warm in the firelight. "I promised you, on our wedding night, that I could still perform, still please you, despite everything the world believed I had lost. I meant it then, as a wounded man's defiance. I mean it now, Eleanor, as a whole man's devotion. I can still be everything you need, not because my body proves it, but because my heart has finally remembered how." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, warm and grateful rather than sorrowful. "You have always been everything I need, Nathaniel. From the very first night, when you looked at me honestly instead of with pity, I knew there was more strength in you than the world gave you credit for." "Then let us build the rest of our life on that truth," Nathaniel said, "together, without fear, and without ever again letting anyone convince us that love requires a body without flaw to be real and lasting." Outside, snow had begun to fall softly over the gardens of Camden Hall, settling gently upon the thorny rose bushes his mother had planted so many years before, patient stems that had weathered every winter without complaint, trusting always that spring would return exactly as it had promised. Inside, by the warm glow of the fire, a duke and his duchess sat together in comfortable silence, their hands joined, their hearts finally at peace, having proven, through every trial the world had thrown against them, that love, built on honesty and courage, could weather any storm, and emerge, in the end, stronger and truer than either of them had ever believed possible. Word of Edmund's withdrawn petition spread through society far more quickly than his original accusations had, and within weeks, the whispers that had once painted Nathaniel as broken and unfit had transformed into something entirely different: admiration for a duke who had faced scandal, injury, and betrayal with unshaken dignity, and respect for the duchess who had stood beside him through every difficult hour. Invitations began arriving at Camden Hall in greater numbers than either of them had seen since the accident, though Nathaniel accepted only the ones that felt genuine rather than merely curious. Charlotte returned for Christmas, delighted beyond words to find her brother so thoroughly transformed from the guarded, distant man she had visited only months before. She embraced Eleanor tightly upon arrival, whispering that she had never seen Nathaniel look so entirely at peace, not even before the accident had changed everything. "You have given him back to himself," Charlotte said one evening, as the three of them sat together decorating the drawing room with holly and winter greenery. "I do not think I can ever thank you enough for that." "He found his own way back," Eleanor said, glancing fondly toward Nathaniel, who was directing Harmon with great amusement on the precise placement of a garland along the mantelpiece. "I simply refused to let him believe the journey was impossible." That Christmas, Camden Hall hosted its first true gathering since before the accident, a modest winter ball, attended by neighboring families, tenants, and the few London friends who had remained loyal throughout the difficult months. Eleanor watched with quiet pride as Nathaniel moved through the crowded rooms in his chair, with easy confidence, laughing freely, discussing estate matters and local news, with a warmth that drew people toward him, rather than making them hesitant to approach, exactly as it should have been all along. Lady Winslow attended as well, greeting Eleanor with genuine warmth this time, rather than mere curiosity. "I must say, Duchess," she remarked, watching Nathaniel across the room, "your husband has become quite the topic of admiration in recent weeks, rather than pity. It seems love agrees with him considerably." "It agrees with both of us," Eleanor said, smiling as Nathaniel caught her eye from across the room and offered a private, warm smile meant only for her. Later that night, once the guests had departed and the great house had settled back into its familiar quiet, Eleanor and Nathaniel sat together by the fire once more, exhausted but content, reflecting on how far they had traveled since that first frightened carriage ride through Camden Hall's iron gates. "Do you remember," Eleanor asked softly, "what you said to me on our wedding night? That whatever else the world believed was broken in you, you could still perform, still please me." "I remember," Nathaniel said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I meant it as a challenge to the world, back then. A promise made more from fear than confidence." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now," Nathaniel said, drawing her hand to his lips. "I understand. It was never truly about proving anything to anyone else at all. It was about learning, finally, to believe it myself." He looked at her with eyes full of quiet certainty. "You did that, Eleanor. You gave me back not just my confidence, but my belief that I was still worthy of love, exactly as I am." "You were always worthy," Eleanor whispered. "You simply needed someone patient enough to help you remember it." As the fire burned low and snow continued falling softly outside the windows of Camden Hall, the Duke and his Duchess sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had weathered every storm the world could throw against them, and had found, in each other, something far stronger than pity, far deeper than obligation, and far more lasting than any title or fortune could ever provide. Spring arrived early the following year, coaxing the first stubborn buds from the rose bushes Nathaniel's mother had planted so long ago, and with it came news that filled Camden Hall with a joy neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel had dared to hope for so soon. Eleanor had suspected for several weeks, but it was the physician's careful confirmation, one bright March morning, that finally made the truth undeniable. She was carrying their child. She found Nathaniel in his study, reviewing correspondence from a tenant regarding the spring planting, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching him before she spoke, memorizing the quiet contentment that had become so natural to his face in recent months. "Nathaniel," she said softly, and something in her voice made him look up immediately, setting his papers aside. "What is it?" he asked, wheeling toward her, with the faint concern that still sometimes flickered across his features whenever her tone shifted unexpectedly. Eleanor crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking both his hands in hers. "The physician confirmed it this morning," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We are going to have a child, Nathaniel. Sometime in autumn, he believes." For a moment, Nathaniel simply stared at her, as though the words needed time to settle fully into understanding. Then his face transformed entirely, joy breaking across his features so completely that Eleanor felt her own heart nearly burst at the sight of it. He drew her into his arms, holding her as tightly as his chair allowed, his voice rough with emotion when he finally spoke. "A child," he said softly, wonder threaded through every word. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means? Every doctor who examined me after the accident insisted this would never be possible. Edmund built his entire scheme upon that very assumption. Then I suppose we shall both take great pleasure in proving them wrong," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. News of the coming heir spread through the county with remarkable speed, and the remaining whispers that had ever questioned Nathaniel's fitness as Duke, finally, fully, fell silent. Even those who had once hesitated to fully welcome the couple back into society now sent warm letters of congratulations, and Charlotte, upon receiving the news by post, arrived at Camden Hall within the week, nearly breathless with excitement. "I am to be an aunt," she declared, embracing them both in turn. "I confess, I have never been so pleased to hear news in all my life." The months that followed passed in a warmth and anticipation that filled every corner of Camden Hall. Eleanor found herself the center of gentle fussing from Mrs. Ashby, who had grown entirely devoted to her mistress over the preceding year, and from Nathaniel himself, who insisted on accompanying her on every garden walk, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of managing the gravel paths alone. "Humor me," he said, one warm afternoon in early summer, as they made their slow way past the roses, now blooming in full, fragrant glory. "I spent 2 years believing I would never again feel useful to anyone. Allow me the small pleasure of fussing over my wife and child while I still can." "I do not mind the fussing," Eleanor admitted, smiling as she settled onto a garden bench beside his chair. "I only worry that you work yourself too hard managing the estate, on top of worrying over me." "The estate has never run more smoothly," Nathaniel said, and it was true. In the months since Edmund's defeat, Nathaniel had thrown himself into improving Camden Hall's holdings with renewed purpose, introducing new farming methods on the tenant lands, expanding the household's charitable efforts in the nearby village, and corresponding regularly with other landowners, eager to learn from his careful, thoughtful management. What had once been a source of shame, his inability to ride the fields himself, had become instead a strength, forcing him to develop a deeper understanding of his lands through conversation, careful record-keeping, and genuine relationships with his tenants, rather than mere oversight from horseback. As summer deepened into autumn, Eleanor's time drew near, and the household held its collective breath with anticipation. Nathaniel remained close throughout those final weeks, reading to her in the evenings, holding her hand through the discomforts of those last difficult days, refusing to leave her side, even when Mrs. Ashby gently suggested he might find the coming hours easier to bear from his study. "I have missed enough in my life to fear," he told her firmly. "I will not miss this." The child, a healthy daughter with her mother's steady eyes and her father's dark hair, arrived on a crisp October morning, her first cries filling Camden Hall with a sound of pure, unshakable joy. Nathaniel wept openly when the midwife placed his daughter in his arms, an emotion he made no effort whatsoever to hide, his gray eyes shining as he looked between his exhausted, radiant wife and the small, perfect life they had created together. "She is beautiful," he whispered, tracing a gentle finger along his daughter's tiny cheek. "Eleanor, she is entirely beautiful." "She has your eyes," Eleanor said softly, exhaustion and happiness mingling equally in her voice. "She has your strength," Nathaniel corrected gently. "I can already see it in the way she refuses to stop crying until she is heard." They named her Rose, in honor of the garden that had witnessed so much of their story unfold. From that first quiet morning, when Nathaniel had spoken of his mother's patience, to every difficult and joyful moment since. As word of the birth spread, Camden Hall received an outpouring of warm wishes from across the county and beyond, a stark and welcome contrast to the cruel rumors that had once threatened to tear their family apart entirely. Even Edmund, humbled considerably by his failed scheme and the modest, quiet life he had since retreated into, sent a brief note of congratulations, which Nathaniel read with a thoughtful expression before setting aside without bitterness. "Do you forgive him?" Eleanor asked, watching her husband's face carefully. "I forgive him enough to wish him a better life than the one his greed nearly cost him," Nathaniel said. "I do not forget what he attempted, nor do I trust him easily again. But holding on to that anger serves nothing now, not when I have everything I could ever want sitting right here beside me." As winter approached once more, nearly a full year after Eleanor had first arrived at Camden Hall as a frightened stranger, she found herself sitting by the same window where she and Nathaniel had once watched the gardener trim hedges in the pale autumn light, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, her husband beside her, his hand resting warmly over hers. "Do you remember what I told you that first morning?" Nathaniel asked quietly, watching the snow begin to gather softly on the garden roses outside. "About my mother, and her belief that a garden shows more patience than any person she ever knew, waiting through winter without complaint, trusting spring would come?" "I remember," Eleanor said softly. "I did not fully believe it myself, back then," Nathaniel admitted. "I had spent too long convinced that my own winter would never end. But you taught me otherwise, Eleanor. You taught me that spring comes, not because we simply wait for it, but because we choose, every single day, to keep believing it is possible, even when the proof has not yet arrived. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their daughter's small chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, feeling a contentment so complete it nearly took her breath away. "Then I suppose we found our spring after all," she whispered. "We did," Nathaniel agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair. "And I intend to spend every remaining day of my life making certain it never fades again." Outside, the snow continued falling gently over Camden Hall, blanketing the sleeping roses in soft white silence, patient and certain, exactly as they always had been, waiting once more for spring to prove, as it always did, that even the longest winter eventually gives way to warmth, to growth, and to the quiet, unshakable joy of love that has weathered every storm and found, at last, a home worth keeping. Charlotte visited again that Christmas, cradling her small niece with a tenderness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, marveling aloud at how completely her brother had transformed since that first anxious letter she had received, announcing his marriage to a stranger. "I confess," Charlotte admitted one evening, as they sat together watching Nathaniel gently rock his daughter before the fire. "When Father first arranged this match, I feared it would only bring you both more sorrow. A marriage built on necessity rarely finds warmth, in my experience." "I feared the same," Eleanor admitted. "I arrived here certain I was marrying a stranger's obligation, not a man I could ever truly know, let alone love. And yet here you are," Charlotte said softly, watching her brother hum a quiet tune to his daughter, his voice low and unpracticed but full of tenderness. "I have never seen him so at peace, Eleanor, not even before the accident, if I am honest. There was always a restlessness in him then, a hunger for more than what he had. I do not see that hunger any longer. I see a man who has finally found enough." Eleanor watched her husband a moment longer, feeling her heart swell with a quiet gratitude that had only deepened with each passing month. "He gave me the same gift," she said. "I arrived here believing myself unworthy of real love, after everything with Lord Vane. Nathaniel taught me otherwise, simply by refusing to see me as anything less than whole." As the new year approached, Nathaniel began making plans neither Eleanor nor Charlotte had expected, quietly corresponding with an architect regarding modifications to the east wing of Camden Hall, wider doorways, gentler ramps replacing several staircases, practical changes that would make the house easier for him to move through independently, without relying so heavily on Harmon's assistance for every small errand. "I spent 2 years resenting this house for reminding me of everything I had lost," he explained to Eleanor, when she asked what had inspired the sudden change. "I think it is time I made it reflect instead the life I actually intend to live in it, rather than the life I once mourned losing." Eleanor took his hand, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said. "This house has certainly earned the chance to grow alongside us." By the time the roses bloomed again, the following spring, Camden Hall had transformed in more ways than one, its wider doorways and gentler pathways standing as quiet testament to a household that no longer hid its master's needs, but simply accommodated them with the same practical warmth that had come to define every corner of their life together. Little Rose grew stronger each day, filling the halls with the sound of laughter that had been absent for far too long, and Nathaniel, watching his daughter take her first unsteady steps across the nursery floor one bright morning in April, turned to Eleanor, with tears of pure joy shining in his eyes. "She walks toward you," he said softly, watching Rose toddle determinedly across the room into her mother's waiting arms, "and toward me, exactly as she is, without ever once looking back to wonder if either of us is whole enough to deserve her love. I think, perhaps, we could all learn something from that." Eleanor smiled, gathering her daughter close, her husband's hand finding hers, as they had so many times before, through fear and doubt and every trial the world had placed before them. "I think we already have," she said softly, and together, in the warm spring light of Camden Hall, they watched their daughter laugh, certain at last that whatever winters still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had learned to face everything else, together, unafraid, and entirely, unshakably in love.